mental health podcast where we take social issues, pop culture, and politics and boil them down into mental health focus. Today, I wanted to talk a little bit more about words, which is something I've discussed before, but I wanted to focus in on them in a slightly different way because, as some are framing it, there's kind of a war on words going on right now. Not that it's a new thing. I can think of plenty of examples historically and from the recent past where this has been going on, like the whole war on Christmas thing. But it seems like it's coming to a head in a number of different arenas where now people are frequently getting deplatformed, fired, removed from positions and what have you for simply saying certain things, regardless of the context. So I want to start off by just thinking about what really are words when we really think about it. Because if we're boiling this down to base fact, and I don't want to be insensitive to how people feel about words. I'm going to get into that in a bit, but just boiling it down to the basic idea of what is a word. It's simply a combination of letters that we form into sounds that we breathe out of our mouth. That's it. From a scientific standpoint, that is all words are. They are not something that in and of themselves can cause undue harm. It's not like a bullet flying out of a gun that can actually cause physical damage to you. This is just a combination of sounds that are coming out of us and are then perceived in different ways by the people around us. And I think it's that perception piece where things start to really go off the rails. So part of that has to do with context. Now, I've been saying a lot lately that I'd be really curious to get George Carlin's take on how things are going right now. Because if you think of I argue, the greatest comedian potentially of all time, George Carlin, he was a big proponent of free speech and being able to say all manner of kind of vulgar and unusual and off-color things, because that's kind of what comedy is. It's supposed to be an arena where you do push boundaries and you do challenge ideas, and hopefully in a creative and clever kind of way. To me, that's the difference between good comedy and bad comedy, is not necessarily the topic, but how are they presenting it? Are they being lazy and just kind of throwing words out there simply to be offensive, or are they making an interesting take on it? So he had this famous routine from, I believe, back in the 70s. It was called like the 7 words routine, and he would boil down the 7 words, and obviously there are more than that, but he would boil it down to kind of 7 words that you're not allowed to say, and he would rattle them all off, and he would go into this whole tirade about how it's not the words themselves that's the problem, it's the context. And I argue that that is 100% true. Again, these are just sounds coming out of our mouths, but it's how they are perceived by others, which has to do with in what combination are those words presented and how are they presented, with what tone and in what environment and with which people, and so on and so forth. So I think this is where we have to draw the line between what's offensive and what's harassment, because I think those are two very different things. But just as an aside, again, I'd be really interested to hear George Carlin speak on this now, because he's a pretty liberal-minded person. If you watch his old routines, he does a lot of stuff kind of ragging on stuffy old conservative types, and definitely falls more into that sort of left-leaning think tank. And that made sense at the time because by and large, it was those kind of more right-leaning conservative types that were trying to censor different types of speech and different things that you say. But I would say that now it's kind of swung very far in the other direction, where it's the more kind of progressive, left-leaning folks that are saying, no, you can't say that. No, you can't do that. We're not going to allow that. In fact, we're going to boycott, and we're going to, do an ad campaign to get you to lose your sponsors and so on and so forth. It happens on both sides, but it just seems like it has swung further in the other direction. That's not a statement of blame or me trying to, just make a generalization about an entire group. It's just an observation I've made. Again, I'm trying to present this from as neutral and objective as I possibly can, but I am a human being, and so there's going to be some subjectivity here, obviously. But going back to the idea of offensive versus harassment, so harassment is obviously not good. There is some much more serious damage that happens there when you're repeatedly told by somebody the same thing over and over again. You're being called the same name by them over and over again. The concept, I don't really like the term bullying. I think it's too vague. But still, that idea that if you're on a daily basis or weekly basis or just repeatedly being belittled by somebody, often by using specific words, then that's clear harassment. And we already have policies and laws and things in place to respond to that. There's plenty of examples that we could look up in terms of somebody was being harassed or stalked or bullied intensely enough that action had to be taken. And that could be at a school level where there's some sort of corrective action, or the student's suspended, or any number of reactions, or it could be taken all the way up to a legal context where people have gone to jail for these types of things. And I think that's fair, because if you're doing this repeated work to belittle the person and ultimately make them feel afraid, because you don't know what this other person's going to do. You don't know if their words are going to escalate to something more harmful and cause you physical harm at that point. And that's kind of traumatizing on some level. So it's good that we have regulations in place to deal with that. That is very different from something being offensive. Because something being offensive is simply, you're watching a movie or a comedy routine and somebody says something that makes you feel uncomfortable. You are offended by what was said. Or you could be watching a news thing, or you could be having a conversation with somebody you know, or overhear a conversation, and it simply makes you feel uncomfortable. That's not harassment. I'm going to say more towards the end about just what do we need to do about being offended, because it's a real thing, and it's worthy of conversation and further discussion. But ultimately, I don't agree with the idea of regulating it for a lot of different reasons. But first and foremost, if we look at fascistic regimes, like real ones, in other countries where you have this autocracy, often where that begins and what you'll see is a strong regulation of speech. You are only allowed to say certain things, and you are not allowed to say certain things, and all the way to the extreme of people disappearing from their homes and never being seen again because they spoke out against the government or just said the wrong thing in general that they were not allowed to say, and now they are disappeared into some secret prison or are murdered in front of a firing squad, whatever. That stuff happens, and I don't like the idea of over-regulating things just because some people don't like it. I mean, imagine being in the United States right now and not being able to speak out against the current government. I mean, that would be insane. And this isn't an argument against Trump or anyone else. I'm just saying I'm glad I live in a country where we are allowed to, for all the complaints we make about, what government response is to different news stories and whatnot, at the end of the day, we're still allowed to say whatever we want, even when it becomes quite inflammatory. I'm glad there are certain things in place in terms of just outright lying and slandering, because there's plenty of that right now, especially with the growth of social media. People just share fake information constantly. But we're still allowed to share our opinions in any number of different ways, and I think that's very important for society. But my own personal example of my offense is I'll occasionally come across dead baby jokes. I remember even just a year or two ago, there was like a comic strip with a Grim Reaper, and it like turns the baby into like a skeleton baby so that they can have their own kid. And it's kind of like meant to be this sort of harmless but somewhat edgy cartoon. And I didn't really like looking at it because as somebody who has lost an unborn child, that kind of hit me in a deep place. It didn't make me laugh. I understood why it was funny, but to me, I was, if I'm just using that simple term, offended by it. However, I didn't feel the need to report it and say, hey, I don't like this. This shouldn't be here. And I didn't even go to the comments section and say, hey, this upset me. You shouldn't be posting things like that. I acknowledged that, first of all, why I was feeling the way I was feeling, and then acknowledged why they posted it and why other people might think it was funny and how I might have even found it to be funny in the past, and said, okay, that's fine. Like, they're trying to make people laugh. I didn't find it funny, so therefore I'm going to hide this post and I'm not going to look at it. Move on with my day. I feel like that would be a much more productive way of looking at things. And I feel like it used to be much more like that, even in the past couple years. Really, it's just amped up into this other direction more recently. So it comes down to, separating feelings versus behaviors too, because I had clear feelings in that situation, but I acknowledged where they were coming from and did not, as a result, translate that into a behavior that I find to be somewhat fascistic, as I put. Which to me, it's very ironic because I've said before, I don't hate the people in Antifa. I think most people, when they're doing things I disagree with, it's because they lack information and are just kind of ignorant of what it is that they're actually doing. But I feel like the real irony of a lot of what Antifa does is that they are pushing kind of fascistic idea of, you can't do this, you can't say this, you're going to do and say what we tell you to do. That to me is sort of the definition of fascism. So just a little irony there. Again, I don't want anyone to go out and harass people that are, active members of Antifa. They're all just people doing what I honestly think that most of them believe what they're doing is right and that they're just desperate for a cause. But all that to say, I definitely do not agree with what they're doing and would like to see some changes happen there. So speaking of that level of empathy, that is important. So I said before that I don't want to belittle and minimize how people feel about these things. Because again, using my own example, I on some level know what it's like for an image or a word to very deeply strike a chord within me and make me feel kind of uncomfortable and anxious and even sort of depressed. And that's a real thing. And we can even add on to it this term called epigenetics. And I'm not going to get too in-depth with this, but the basic idea of epigenetics is that they're theorizing, and this has been studied more and more lately, that our ancestors' reactions to things and things like how they handled their diet and particular stressors and triggers that they dealt with on a repeated basis get basically encoded into their genes and then get passed on to future generations. So, for example, there's this study, and I'll just throw out there too that this is somewhat a controversial study. I've seen some people arguing about the validity of the results and what it actually means and whether it was done well, but I think it's a nice example just sort of illustrating the idea of what this means in terms of particularly kind of emotional responses to things and fight or flight responses to things. So they took a cage full of rats. It's rats or mice, but I'm just going to say rats. And they had the floor of the cage electrified. So this is not a new experiment. This kind of goes all the way back to things like Pavlov and conditioning and studying all those basic elements of our responses. But anyways, they took these rats, put them in the cage, and what they did is they took a neutral stimulus. In this case, it was like a citrus smell spray. And every time they would spray this smell into the cage so that the rats could smell it, and then they would shock them with the electrified floor. And so I've talked before about kind of the pairing process and how we form connections in our brain, literal neural pathways when we repeatedly encounter something. This could be learning an instrument or learning a language, practicing a sport. But in the case of trauma responses and fight or flight and survival, it has to do with things like this. So their body and their brain was acknowledging that that smell means that we are in danger and could be in a life-threatening situation. So over time, what happened is that without the shocks, when they would spray the citrus smell, it had been paired so deeply and connected in their brain so deeply that correlation between those two things that they would go into a frenzy every time they smelled the smell, because their body again just knew that, oh, that smell means danger. So that's nothing new. But then what they did do to take it a step further is they then took those rats and they bred them. And then they took the babies of those rats and they put them in a regular cage with no electrified floor, didn't do any experimenting on them, and they sprayed the citrus smell at the offspring of these rats. And guess what happened? The babies went into a frenzy as well, despite, again, having never experienced that pairing process. They had never experienced the electrified cage and had never even smelled that citrus smell before. But because they were the offspring of these other rats who had been through that process, the theory goes that that trigger, that potential threat of the citrus smell had been encoded into their genes as a way to not only help them survive, but help their offspring survive. And there's all sorts of ways you could apply this to current social situations. They've been doing studies on like multiple generations down from Holocaust survivors and how their stress thresholds tend to be higher as if they had been there themselves. I also think about all the stuff that happens with altercations with the police, and I wonder if some of these people have past generations from, say, like the civil rights movement who were actively being attacked by police dogs and sprayed with fire hoses by police officers, and now they have a built-in encoded genetic response to the police officer uniform and just how they present themselves. So I think this has applications also in terms of how we think about speech. Because if you think about it, again, there could be certain trigger words that people have encountered over and over and over again, and perhaps that has now been encoded into it. And so there's more than just the hypothetical construct of, well, there's historical context to this word. It's also could, maybe someone's great-great-great-grandfather who was repeatedly harassed by being called the N-word over and over and over again, could that be imprinted in his DNA and now have been passed along to future generations where now when they hear that word, they just have this built-in kind of fear and anger response to that word? It's entirely possible. And I think it's good for people to know that. I'm glad society is moving to a place where we are talking about these things, we're bringing them to light, and we're trying to basically build better understanding and empathy for why certain things cause people to react in certain ways. Where it goes off the rails for me is not that framing of it, it's the solutions that we're coming up with. I feel like we keep getting to this place of oh, that thing makes people uncomfortable. It makes people feel a certain way, and therefore we just shouldn't have that thing. And in order to not have that thing, we should have laws and regulations in place to stop that thing from happening. I think that is the problem. I don't think that's really an effective solution to what we're seeing. Going back to my own expertise again is in trauma and treating trauma. So I think about this in that same context. So how do we treat trauma? Well, first of all, we try to get the client to identify the underlying processes that are leading them to have these counterproductive responses. So I've worked with many, many kids who didn't really get why they were becoming aggressive and violent or severely depressed to the point of becoming suicidal and self-harming, self-medicating with drugs. They were kind of coming up with sort of kid version basic idea of, oh, my life just sucks, or I hate school, or nobody likes me, or whatever. And that may be part of it, but a big first step is helping them understand things like the hand model of the brain and the idea that these past things that happened to them have now kind of hardwired their brain and body to respond in certain ways to certain things in certain situations. So same with the words that I'm talking about. So building awareness is the first step, and I've already kind of talked about that a little bit. And then we teach them skills to better manage those emotional and physical responses that they're having to those things. So getting them to a place where it's no longer, I'm in X situation and this thing happens and that triggers me to become aggressive. It's now, ooh, I'm starting to feel that same feeling in my body. This is probably that trauma stuff. This trauma thing is coming up in me, and hey, I've learned some breathing techniques and relaxation skills, muscle relaxation, pressure activities, what have you. I'm going to use some of those to help manage that response. And I'm amazed at how many people kind of joke and belittle regarding like breathing and basic strategies for dealing with those things. But the reality is, if you look at research in terms of most effective treatments for certain things, for anxiety, breathing techniques are I believe the most effective thing in not only managing but also changing that response over time, even higher so than something like medication, which is why I always encourage people to go to actual therapy. They may need medication for some time to help get the response to a level that it is manageable, but the ultimate goal needs to be developing strategies that allow you to challenge and change the response over time. And same with depression, exercise is at the top of the list in terms of what is actually helpful in changing that. And that's hard because when you're depressed, you don't really want to throw on your gym clothes and head out the door to the gym, but that's what's going to help. So we need to consider that. So we help build awareness. We teach them skills to manage the response when they're having that awareness. And then for more intensive treatments like I do with trauma, we also go through a whole kind of desensitizing and reintegration process to help them better develop functioning. The analogy I often use for this is that of a tub full of hot bath water. So consider a bathtub that has hot water in it, not so hot that it's going to scald you, but hot enough that it's kind of uncomfortable to put your foot in it. So the way I describe a typical day-to-day trauma response for someone is that throughout the day, things are said and things are done, and certain reminders around them cause them to jam their foot in that hot bath water. And then they feel that burning discomfort, and their response is to what? Yank their foot out of the bathwater, and so that they don't have to feel that feeling anymore. And that's them responding with the self-harm and the drug use and aggressive releases and things of that nature. The problem is that if you keep yanking your foot out of the bathwater, you never adjust to it. You're going to continue to have that cycle over and over again. You're getting your foot jammed in, it feels hot, it feels uncomfortable, you yank it back out. Happens again later, same thing. And it just goes on over and over and over and over, and it never gets better. What we do with these reintegration processes is we hold their foot in the bathwater. We kind of ease it in slowly, but we get them to a place where we are holding our foot in the bathwater so that what happens over time? Your body adjusts to the temperature. Your body acknowledges that, oh, okay, I'm not burning here. I'm not going to get damage to my skin or, the rest of my body. This is actually okay. And you develop just that desensitized response to, okay, now I can have my foot in here and I don't even have to think about it. It feels okay now. And so that goes beyond just teaching skills. We're actually helping them reprocess in a number of different ways. I do it with TFCBT, with trauma narratives, but there's also different ways of handling it, like EMDR, which is really picking up steam and showing some really positive results. But ultimately, the idea is, instead of just putting a Band-Aid on it with skills, we're actually really trying to do some healing by sort of repairing and re-responding and building new neural pathways literally in the brain, kind of doing non-invasive brain surgery to an extent to repair those damaged areas of the brain that are responding at too much of a heightened level to these trauma triggers so that they can go about their day better. So again, that is all very important. That is the way to treat a emotional response to something in an effective way. Now, I will say we also include work with all of the other systems involved with this person, including the family, the school, other people they interface with in the community, so that those people can better support and understand what is going on. I'm a huge proponent of going out and speaking at schools and speaking in front of faculty and giving education to families, either in group or individually, about these things. And so there is a component of this in speech too, where I'm not saying, well, suck it up and just deal with it. Like, no, it's worth talking about. It's worth having these conversations. But the thing is, when I talk about trauma, when I talk with these families and faculty, I never demonize them because, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, it's not a matter of they're bad people and they're out to upset other people. I think that's a huge problem with our just human way of looking at things is we like to drop things in categories, and right now everything that is offensive or uncomfortable gets kind of thrown into the bad guy category. And so if they're saying this thing, therefore that means that they're just bad people and they want to hurt this group of people that they're talking about, or this group of people that are offended by this word that they're saying. But it's so much more complex than that. And in most cases, again, it just comes down to they believe what they're saying is true and that it's helpful. And in many cases, that's often not true. There's so much misinformation even about trauma and mental health that floats around that seems to make common sense, but it's not true in practice. So again, I factor that in. And I'll usually say that to the people. I'm like, look, let's take the example of spanking. On a very basic level, it seems to follow that if your child is doing a bad thing and you don't want them to do it anymore, and if you spank them, they don't like to be spanked, and they're pairing the spanking with the thing that they did, and over time they will learn to not do that thing. That seems to make sense, and there is some truth to that, but what research is showing now on top of that is that the act of spanking is also forming other neural pathways in the brain that have to do with trauma responses and potentially increases in their own aggression and resentment and negative thinking, depression, anxiety, which plays into any number of dysfunctional behaviors and ways of functioning. So I'll say that to them, like, look, I get it. Like, for a long time, I thought the same way you did. There's so much information out there that seems to make sense about this. So I'm not here to tell you that, like, you're an idiot or that you shouldn't have thought that way or even that you're wrong. Like, some of that makes sense. Some of that probably is true. And there's also this other thing. Could I kind of take some of your time to talk to you about that? And when I take that approach, they listen. They listen a lot and they learn and they change their behavior. I've worked with, again, I've said this before, some of the most challenging kids and families that you could imagine, and who were very averse at first to being told something different from what they already believed. But through empathy and through allowing them a space to feel heard and letting them know that, hey, I get it. This is a complex topic. People aren't naturally taught this. I think some of this just comes down to some information you may not have. And I'm not going to tell you what to do. This is your house. This is your prerogative. But could I share some of what I know with you? And we can have a conversation about that. And if you feel like that's still a bunch of hokum, then tell me that, and that's fine. And 9 times out of 10, they would take that and they'd run with it, and I'd see them change their ways of handling things. And I said this in a previous podcast, that the only true way for you to be heard, if you're trying to get a point across, if you're trying to challenge and change other people's behavior, the only way to get there is to first have empathy for them and listen to them. Truly listen in a non-judgmental, active way, and let them know that you're listening. Once they feel heard, you're going to open the door to all sorts of conversation where you can share your viewpoint and possibly make some real great headway. And you're going to learn from each other a lot. And it's really valuable. I have these conversations all the time. I can't imagine a world without them. I can, but it's pretty dystopian. And I don't want that. So I argue we should be using the same approach when it comes to use of language. We should be building people's awareness of how this could be, negatively received. Things like, people talk about the R word. Honestly, I have no problem saying these words, but we're in a situation now where honestly someone could listen to this podcast, and if I say the word out loud, they take a sound bite, they post it somewhere, and all of a sudden mental health is, ableist and terrible people, and they should be shut down, and my podcast gets taken down. That's the scary world that I feel like we're living in right now. But in any case, hopefully you know what I mean by the R word. We can build an awareness, and we have. That's a word that's not really commonly used anymore. I don't even hear kids saying it as much. That's not to say people don't say it at all, but it used to be almost part of sort of the normal lexicon of conversation. And it's changed largely through people having conversations about, hey, like, this is why I don't really like that word, and it could, upset this group of people because of this. And over time, people have decided, just as a group, that, it's not really a word I really want to use anymore. And I'm fine with that. Like, I'm fine with that natural journey of just deciding. I can think of plenty of words that I used to use that I really don't anymore. And I'm even more careful about certain clothes that I wear and certain insignias and whatnot. I don't think that they're bad things in and of themselves, but I just acknowledge that in certain arenas, like I don't really wear like my, for example, I have a Blackhawks jacket, and I try not to really wear it at work because I know that some people are upset by that logo, and I get that. I think it's fair. That doesn't necessarily mean that I think the logo should be changed. I think that's a valid conversation and thing to have, but again, context matters, and that's my own personal journey. I've just sort of gotten through natural conversation and listening to things and talking to people to a place where I feel differently about that now. I think that's good. I think personal growth is the way to go, and we've seen examples time and time again where this has happened. Using the example of comedy again, I'm totally fine with a comedian who gets to a point saying that, I don't really think this word is funny anymore. I don't really want to use it anymore. And on the flip side too, I'm fine with if the audience just stops finding a comedian funny because of particular words or phrases that they're using and thinks that they're outdated and no longer funny, and they just stop showing up to the shows. And that's going to impact that own person's thinking about themselves as well. That's totally fine. That's like the, just natural growth and development and evolution kind of taking place as it does every single day. But there's a difference between that and trying to force it. So when it turns into outrage mobs and boycotting and people's shows getting shut down and picketed, and especially when it gets to the point of setting up regulation and laws and things getting taken down from Netflix and whatnot just because certain groups of people find something offensive, that disturbs me. Again, because on one level, I feel like that is the road to some very, very bad things where, not to be an alarmist, but it has potential to escalate to much more regulation that has unintended consequences on just sort of day-to-day functioning. And on a simpler level, it's just counterproductive. People don't like being told what to think and do. I mean, that's particularly true of the kids I work with, but ultimately, I mean, we talk about being adults. We're really just big kids. We're just taller, older kids with slightly better brain functioning. But at the end of the day, we still have those same basic responses where, and I've said this before, think about the last time somebody said, "You're wrong, this is what you should think." My guess is your immediate response wasn't, "You're right, I should think that way." No, it was probably like, "You're not going to tell me how to think and how to act, excuse me." So, you end up having the opposite effect. People start digging in their heels. We see that all the time, too. The more you push, the more certain groups of people and certain people just dig their heels in and sometimes swing further in the other direction, which is exactly what you don't want. There's a great example of just how far this has gone. And, this is just an isolated example, but I've heard enough of these that it concerns me. But yeah, I was listening to the Joe Rogan podcast, which I'm a big fan of. I like the diversity of all these different people he has on from so many different backgrounds and just gives them room to kind of speak in long form. But in any case, they were talking about the story of this Netflix executive who, so one of Joe Rogan's comedian friends, I'm forgetting which one it was. He did a routine in his Netflix special where he was talking about the R word. And first of all, it was not even a routine like making light of the R word, from my understanding. He was just pointing out the same thing that I just said, that, there's certain words that we just don't really use anymore. Have you noticed that? Like particularly the R word. Who uses the R word anymore? And so again, he wasn't making fun of a group of people or necessarily trying to be offensive by using a certain word. He was just making an observation. But anyways, some people got mad and they felt those feelings. And again, those feelings are valid, but they took it to a place, again, behaviorally, that I don't agree with. They decided to lodge a bunch of complaints and basically say, you need to take this special off the air, which I think is too far. I think the smarter reaction is to have conversations, talk to people about why you didn't like that, but ultimately just say, I'm not going to watch that because it doesn't really align with what I think and what I like, and I don't find it funny. But in any case, that's not even the real story. The real story is then it got taken to a meeting of Netflix leadership, and they were talking about why the special couldn't air with that segment. And at some point, one of the leadership people said, it's like using the N-word against black people, except he didn't say the N-word. He said the N-word in full with the hard R and everything. But here's the thing. Again, that leadership person was not making a commentary on black people. He was making a statement of a fact, basically. He was just pointing out what other people do and what often happens. He was saying that saying the R word could be as offensive to one group of people as saying the N word is to another group of people. He ultimately was forced to step down for making that comment in a leadership meeting. To me, that is outrageous. I could totally get it if he was in the meeting and he was harassing somebody and he was calling someone the N word just to their face, or even just behind their back, just saying like, oh, this person's an N-word. In a professional meeting, that totally makes sense that, that wouldn't be allowed, and that's not okay. People shouldn't, go about their day that way, and there should be consequences, especially in the workplace. But that's not what happened. He was making a comparison and an observation, and that, again, going all the way back to George Carlin and context matters, there was a lot of context to that situation, but ultimately some people decided that it didn't matter. You can't say that word, period. And that led to him losing his job. That's insane. That's a very strange way to handle things. And I argue, again, it's actually giving those words more power to have over people. Because again, what are words? It's a combination of letters and sounds that we're passing out of our vocal cords into the air around us. At the end of the day, that is all words are. But the more we, from a perception side of things, decide that these words are bad and they're damaging, or worse yet, that phrase that words are violence, which I just can't stand. Talk about being offended. That's a phrase that kind of offends me too on an emotional level. We're empowering these words and giving them this potential to cause more harm than they have to. And I was comparing this to, think about the 80s and 90s where rap music was really taking off, and those rap musicians were often using the N-word ad nauseum, just over and over and over again. And I kind of went back and forth for a long time about how I felt about it. But the more I think about it now from a sort of mental health and sociological context, I think that it was a kind of a good thing, because they were sort of taking this word that had all this power behind it, and they were sort of disempowering it. They were trivializing it and turning it into just this thing that they used in their music, and thing that they used to refer to each other, and sometimes in a joking way, sometimes in kind of a friendly way, sometimes in a more provocative way. But in any case, it was said so much that it was kind of taking the sting away from it. And some people argued that that was a bad thing, that we have to keep the sting in it because of the historical context. But the more I think about that argument, I'm like, that's crazy. Why would you want to keep a sting in something so that it continues to be hurtful, when maybe we're on the path to, again, holding our foot in that bathwater and allowing it to not sting anymore, and ceasing to truly care about it? Still understanding the historical context, not forgetting where that word comes from, but also acknowledging that it really doesn't mean that anymore. We've gotten to a point, we progressed as a society to a point that this doesn't have to cause harm to people. That should be a good thing. People throw other stuff around like that too. There's this whole thing with the Baby It's Cold Outside right now, which people aren't listening to that song thinking about how much they, want to have non-consensual sex with each other. That's not that's not why people listen to that song. It is just to get in a holiday spirit and think about, kind of a time gone. And also there was a great article, I believe, written by a feminist that was actually explaining that why in that time period that song didn't even mean what people think it means. I'm not even going to get into that because I'm starting to get past the time that I meant to. But also people talking about using the phrase rule of thumb for an example and getting all upset about what that used to mean. But it's but that's not what that person meant. That phrase has kind of taken on a different meaning. And it's just a thing that we say now to mean that this is just a basic thing that we do. And yeah, there may be this historical context to it that was not good, but we've sort of repurposed it. We've taken it and run a different direction, and we're not advocating for hurting women. We're simply saying that this is just a basic thing that people do. My personal opinion, this isn't really a counseling opinion per se, it's just more of a personal opinion, but I think that's good. I think taking things that were once harmful and instead of shoving them to the side into the dark zone where it's all scary and edgy and people do end up using it for more harm, take it out of that. That's something I like about kind of meme culture too, is that ultimately what they're doing is taking something that's offensive and taking it to such an edgy peak where it ceases to mean the same thing, and you kind of laugh it off. There's this great quote, I forget who it's from, and I'm probably going to get it somewhat wrong, but the basic idea is sometimes you just have to laugh so that you don't cry. And I think it's that same idea. You take something that has so much hate or fear or sadness behind it, and you use it in such a way and with such repetition that you kind of turn it into something else so that it can't do that same harm anymore. I argue that is a good thing. So just kind of summing up, just because a word conjures negative feelings is not in and of itself a bad thing. I've talked before about how anxiety and some feeling of discomfort is necessary in the process of personal development and maturation. So it's important to really embrace that discomfort because it leads to personal growth. So when I encounter things now on a daily basis where it kind of rubs me the wrong way, makes me feel uncomfortable, makes me kind of question whether that should be said or whether there's a better way to say it, or whether the idea is even correct, that pushes me to be like, okay, why, again, building awareness, why does that make me uncomfortable? Why am I having this feeling? Where is this coming from? Is this more of a personal thing? Is this more of a societal thing? Responding with my own skills to, get myself regulated again so I can have my brain fully functioning with the, processing centers instead of just coming from a very fight or flight or emotional place. And then, responding with some really good empathic speech to have a conversation. There are people saying that the cure to bad speech is more speech, and I totally agree with that. Speech done in an effective way and in an open forum where people can feel like they're allowed to say what they need to say without necessarily worrying about some damage that is going to come to them, because they need to be free in fully expressing themselves so that you can understand each other and again, hopefully make some changes there. Another example I always think of, I worked with a young person many years ago who had a real problem with generalizing words like, this is impossible, and I'm never going to get better, and I'm always going to feel this way, and life is always going to be terrible. And we had a heart-to-heart, I think I've shared this in another podcast, but I'll just say it again, where they said at one point, I'm at my limit. And I just paused and I let the silence linger for a minute, and I came back and I said, well, what's that? What's your limit? And they looked at me kind of confused and were like, what do you mean? And I was like, seriously, what's your limit? What do you mean by that? Like, can you show me your limit? And again, they were kind of confused and they're like, what are you getting at? I'm like, here's a yardstick. Can you measure for me on this yardstick where your limit is, where that breaking point is, where you cannot handle this anymore? And he started, I saw this just awareness kind of, seep in behind his eyes, where they were getting at, the point I was making. And he was like, well, no, I can't show you on there. And I was like, okay, why not? And he was just like, well, you can't measure it with a yardstick. Like that's stupid. And I'm like, yeah, that is kind of dumb, right? Like, but why can't we measure it? And we came to this moment where it was like, because it's not real. It's only as real as you make it. Again, those are just words. Those are combinations of letters and sounds that you are passing out into the world around you and also cycling through your brain over and over again. And you're telling yourself that things are impossible and that it's always going to be this way and this good thing is never going to happen and that you're at your breaking point. Those are constructs that we build for ourselves. They're a cage that we kind of put ourselves in. And so I challenged this young person to, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to do this for you, and I want you to do this for yourself, and I'm going to also instruct the staff to help you with this as well. That anytime you use the word impossible, never, always, or I'm at my breaking point or whatever, that we're going to look at you and say something like, try again, or how else could you say that, or whatever. I forget what our prompting phrase was, but he agreed to it and decided, yeah, we can do that. And it really helped. It really helped. We went through this great unpairing process where he was no longer empowering those words. It wasn't that he wasn't allowed to use those words. It was that he was changing the context of them and disempowering them, because he had built them up in his head as these truths that he had to live by. And he was acknowledging an awareness of these are just words, and he was utilizing skills to change those ways of thinking and not even like changing it completely. Like, we didn't want to minimize the situation because there were aspects of their life that were really difficult. And so, but instead of saying, it's impossible for me to get better, we changed it to, it's really hard for me to get better. It's really challenging for me to go through this. It makes me really uncomfortable. It's difficult. but not impossible. So just kind of graying things up, changing just the way that he was thinking about those words instead of such extremes. And let me tell you, this person's anxiety, their anger, their depression slowly just decreased. I could not only would they tell me that they were feeling better, but I could see it visibly in their body language and their facial expressions and how they were presenting with me and with other people, that this was making a huge difference. So again, it's not that those words in and of themselves were bad. It was his perception and the context that they were being put into that was creating physiological negative reactions that were creating just this violence and destructive behavior in this person. And once they were able to acknowledge that these are just words, and they don't have to mean this extreme thing, and they got better. So obviously, again, harassment and bullying can be extremely damaging. If somebody is repeatedly calling you names or belittling you or talking about you behind your back using certain terms, that's not good, and there should be some conversation and recourse around that. But again, simply hearing words and feeling that discomfort and feeling those feelings is on some level a necessary thing for development, and it's worth taking both personal stock in why am I reacting to this, and what can I do about it, and how can I make myself feel better, and how can I stick my foot in the bathwater and learn to be better in terms of this word, and also have good public conversations about your thoughts on the word and why there could be some problems with it, without talking down to people, without demonizing people, without going on to attack where it's going to be counterproductive. So all that to say, I hope that people take this message. Please do share this with people who could use this type of thinking in their daily life, and share it with others. My ultimate goal with this podcast, because I kind of consider it sort of more of my side podcast, is to just put some positivity out there and make it a really good place where I can put some positive vibes and different ways of thinking about things out into the world, and hopefully make a difference in terms of making it a better place overall. So please subscribe, share. It really makes a difference, not necessarily so much for my own sake, but really just to have as many people hear this, and they can disagree. Again, that's the great thing about freedom of speech. They can listen to this and think that it's a bunch of garbage and it's BS, and that is totally fine. That's their prerogative. But I'd like people to at least hear these things and come up with their own actual real interpretations and ways of thinking about them, instead of just going about their day in that bubble I always speak of, thinking only in one way and that everybody thinks that way. So thank you for listening, and as the wise sages Bill and Ted always said, be excellent to each other and party on, dudes.